Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.
It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show for the skeptically spiritual. I'm Christy Powell, and I'm joined again tonight by a writer and psychotherapist. Welcome, Melissa Hargrave.
Thank you so much. My name is Melissa Hargrave with Hill Country Therapy, offering caring solutions to real-life challenges with my expertise.
Hey, so glad to have you here. We had a great conversation about sexual anxiety last time you joined, and I was super excited to have you back. Tonight, we're talking about sexual magic, what the hell that means, where the hell it came from, and what, if anything, the hell that means for you and your partners. So give us a call with your stories and questions at 512-991-9242 or tiny.cc/callsex because the show is coming right now. All right, well, that sound means that we are starting this week like we do every week by talking about what's turning us on this week. Melissa, super glad to have you here. What's turning you on this week?
One of my favorite reads is related to tonight's topic, and it's called The Kiss of the Yogini by David Gordon White.
Yeah, so tell us about The Kiss of the Yogini. This is about yoga. This is about Tantra. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, it's about Southern Asia Tantra. And what I love about it is that David Gordon White translated some texts that haven't been translated in the past in Europe. So it's really exciting information to read that helps fill in kind of the sociocultural history that goes into it.
Yeah, that's something I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later in the conversation, but a lot of these practices that we're talking about are kind of culturally bound or historically bound in a lot of ways, and so getting a little bit of context on that is huge. I will say the thing that's turning me on this week is a little bit less brainy because people might be surprised to hear this, but I am just so excited about the new Halsey album. I don't listen to a lot of pop. If I do listen to pop and I'm going to be talking about it on air, it's because it absolutely slaps. I'm telling you, If I Can't Have Love, I Want Power is an absolutely fantastic record. The very first track is this like incredible, empowering, I guess, rebuke of the rape culture that we all exist in this modern day and age. Its whole album has these like really interesting 90s vibes. It's this very sexy, very feminist record. And if I'm telling you that, it has to be true because this is not the kind of thing I would go out of my way to talk about. So I'd encourage everybody listening to check out that new album. But with that, let's jump into the conversation. And I guess I'll just go ahead and acknowledge here at the top that this is a kind of area or a set of topics that we have really struggled to do a good job with on this show before. And so this is some kind of tricky material, and I would really encourage everybody listening to not give us too much slack, like disagree with the things that you disagree with, but to listen with an open mind. I honestly wouldn't be trusting this material to anybody other than Melissa after our conversations from that first interview. So I'll go ahead and I guess just jump into it by saying that I'm a materialist and an empiricist. I believe that nothing exists except for matter and its movements. I understand that the way that we view the world is all about the knowledge that we derive from an examination of the senses. So my goal tonight is in trying to understand what, if anything, Tantra and some of these other practices can actually offer to folks like me. I'm sure we'll get into this in a lot more detail, Melissa, but how do you respond to some of those ideas?
I love that you're asking. Um, there is a rich history of uh, um, uh, mystical and sexual undertones to religious and spiritual belief systems throughout time.
Hmm.
And I think it's fascinating. Uh, and that history informs us how cultures have thought about relationships, about the way things work in the world. And obviously, they have been meaningful in some form or another because they continue. They have a long line of tradition of continuing. And from my point of view as a sex therapist, the most that I have gotten out of my studies of probably human sexuality, religion, and magical practices related as well has been that mindfulness is really the key to tapping into our pleasure, and education is really the key to tapping into our pleasure. So that's what I think I get the most out of some of these ideas.
Yeah, that notion of mindfulness and focus, I think, is going to be really central to everything we're talking about, more so or in place of some sort of mystical, magical, ineffable force. We're talking about where we rest our attention and where our minds go, and how that's going to naturally have an impact on our lives and our relationships and our connections. That said, it feels like a lot of these practices attract not only a particular worldview and personality type, but also often comes kind of bundled with a belief that like science or rationality or a desire to understand is somehow hindering to the experience or somehow hindering to these practices. And I have to reject that out of hand. So I guess I'm wondering, is it possible to hold both of these things at the same time? To hold on to a desire for like connection and focus and what we might otherwise call magic, while also looking to explore it and understand it through like a very rational worldview?
Yeah, it's not only possible, it's necessary.
Sure.
Um, Really, it's an art and a science. And I think we've seen the problems that come out of treating it as an art or a faith. Um, and my, I think what has helped me the most is doing the research, understanding where some of these practices come from to the best of my ability. And um, it's definitely possible. And let me just speak a second on to the art part.
Mm,
Um, uh, I know that as an atheist can look at the world and say, "Look, science doesn't say that these things, this ineffable idea or these mystical ideas really exist that we can prove." I really think that the idea of science is founded on um, what we don't know. So we ask those questions and we try to get out of our own box to understand what's around us. So I think that the art is just as important as the science, and you can't cut off one arm for the other.
yeah. Well, so long as we are stirring the pot, I guess I wanted to explore the word spirituality because I know just that term in and of itself is kind of an eye roll trigger around the ACA, and not without good reason. You and I talked a little bit before the show, and I really want to acknowledge my compassion for why some of this conversation and why some of these terms can make the hair stand up on the back of our necks. And particularly for people in the atheist community, people who oftentimes have really suffered at the hands of religion, there is a desire to really eschew anything that even looks or smells like magical thinking. So, to that end, I've personally always seen the word spiritual as a valid way of describing ineffable experiences tied to our existential needs. Things like our need for meaning, our need for connection, our inevitability of choice, and the inevitability of death. How do any of these ideas or terms come into this discussion here tonight?
Uh, Actually, you said that better than I could. That was a really fantastic way of saying it. Um, Spirituality to me is separate from religion, where religion is organized around a specific belief system. And people who are into those religions follow them based on the tenets, the values, and the beliefs. Now, spirituality is more diverse and stratified and all over the place. So it is more of what some people look at religion and go, I can't do that, but I can come up with my own spirituality. And I
Mhm.
think you're right. It's tied to our existential needs. Um, and I know that when we look at some of the practices out there, um, like Tantra, especially when it's been kind of removed from its own uh, belief system, where it came from and the culture that it originated from, um, it can look really scary and freaky. But I think that that doesn't mean that we need to invalidate them, because there are things that we can get out of some of these practices. And I have brought together a bunch of practices in my life and my relationships and my practice as a therapist that I think help clients expand their erotic canvas in a way that might not have otherwise without these creative tools. I think.
Yeah, and we may get into it later on, but I know that there are a number of places where I, in my own life, am willing to not. I guess it's not that I am walking away from rationality so much as perhaps giving myself permission to kind of play pretend a little bit. And I do use the term play because I recognize that it is maybe disconnected from in like empirical objective truth, but it's also an opportunity for my mind to just explore an idea in a safe vessel and to experience a little bit of relief from that. One example I like to use is that when I close my eyes and I imagine myself breathing in the suffering of the world and breathing out some sort of healing, I don't actually believe that my breath is being transformed any more than I believe that the, bread and wine are being transformed into the blood of Christ or anything silly like that. I don't think that my breath actually does anything to make the world a better place. However, by being willing to sort of play that game and imagine myself in that way, practicing what we would call Tonglen meditation, I do see myself becoming a little bit softer, a little bit more compassionate, and contributing to a better world. And there's really great research, actually, research coming out of UT Austin that evidences that people that study Tonglen can meaningfully improve in their compassion, and that people who are more compassionate are more likely to contribute to a better world in a number of different ways. So I think that that's a lot of what we're talking about, but still there are so many common misunderstandings, and I feel like so many unnecessary barriers to people connecting with some of these ideas. Do you have a sense of what some of those barriers are, or where some of these barriers come from?
Let me think about that. I, some of the more formalized religions and belief systems around spirituality are really compounded by a lot of moral values that don't fit my worldview. And that can, I have not studied Tantra. That's not something that I've done. And if I did, I would have to buy into the system of wanting to be Buddha,
Mhm.
of wanting to reach Bodhisattva, right? Um, that's not that's not a system that I know well enough, that I've studied well enough, that I feel like I'm a part of. So does that mean that I can't experience some of the shifts in consciousness and perspective if I'm not in that system? No. It just means that I have to find what works for me and um, uh, and work within that.
Sure. Yeah, no, I actually think that's a important point. Not that we would just carelessly cherry pick from these different belief systems, but that also we can see all of these things as a form of rudimentary research. I mean, a lot of these ancient practices continue to linger for a reason, and a lot of that reason can be bundled up into ridiculous geopolitics and can be bundled up into this very like convenient magical thinking and some of these other problematic things. That also doesn't mean that that so-called research hasn't discovered something of value from time to time. And I think that rather than reinventing the wheel in the practice of psychology, that we can actually reap the benefits of some of that early quote unquote research. But in any case, I know that we will work to define things a little bit more concretely, but can you maybe describe some of the practices that we're discussing here? When we talk about magic or tantra or some of these things, is it even fair to lump any of these things together?
I don't know if anything's fair. Um,
Fair to say.
yeah. Well, yeah, and I don't know if I'm lumping them. I just know that for myself, I have taken a look and studied religion back to the, early times, and all the way up to try to understand where did we get some of these ideas that are going on in this world? Like, where do they even come from? What space and time and history did they come from? What was going on during those times that created these? Particularly with the introduction of Christianity coming right after these orgiastic Bacchic rites were just kind of freaking out the town folk a little bit. And, you know, um, and the relationship that you see between Osiris and Christ, and uh, the history is important to understand. I've already forgotten your question, so now I've gotten off on my own tangent.
Yeah, well, just to say, I mean, we're covering so much ground here, and I know for the last like 15 minutes we've been sort of talking about what we're going to talk about, but I guess I just wanted to acknowledge that we are condensing thousands of years of human history and so many different cultures, and I think that we can maybe discuss sort of the meta tools or like how we do that while acknowledging that it's not entirely fair, or maybe it is, to lump some of these things together in these different ways.
No, probably not. And the idea that you and I kind of mentioned tantra. Um, it means many things to many different people, and because people kind of cherry pick what they want and turn it into what they want, and because people have sexual needs and motivations, we do see a lot of weird stuff out there. And
Yeah, fair to say.
I mean, that's kind of what makes humans cool, is that we're kind of weird. Um, I know that in my particular life, I took a path that led me to where I am now. And my path asked me to understand science and the art of, not the art of magical thinking, but creative thinking, getting outside my
Mm,
own box.
I
Oh,
really
and
like that term, that distinction.
yeah, and if you don't mind, I wanted to speak to the idea of energy.
Please.
Because we were talking about last time afterwards, that the idea of energy is really confusing and hard to understand. And how do we explain it? And I don't know how others explain it, but as a sex therapist, um, my understanding of energy is really our sympathetic nervous system, our whole system, all our cells. And, we have a level of arousal all the time because we're alive. That arousal is there. So when I talk about energy, it's really about how are we feeling in our bodies? How are we feeling towards others? How are we relating to ourselves? How are we relating towards others? So just like that meditation you mentioned earlier on compassion, that compassion meditation helps you to feel more softer. And softer is kind of an energy that is
Mm,
hard to explain, but really it's just a feeling, right? When we're excited, we feel an energy that's excited. When we're mad, we can feel that energy that feels mad. So all the different belief systems that I've seen have different words for how to express some of these, and different ideas on what gets in the way of really being present in the moment with ourselves, with our partners, and the world around us. And um, there's lots of really neat ideas on how to become more present. Mm.
No, I think that that was such a valuable thing to address here. Are there any other sort of preconceptions or maybe misconceptions that are worth taking a look at before we, really dive into the history of some of these practices?
No, I mean, there's too many and it's too
Fair to say.
broad. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, there's lots of misconceptions. Even for myself, I have a lot of misconceptions because these ideas, like one of the things I'm studying now is astrology, because we can, not because I believe that it's this tool for divination, but because it's a socio-cultural, historical tool that's been used for thousands of years. And doesn't that fascinate you that we started off studying the stars, and then the Greeks started adding in all the mythos to the stars, and next thing you know, we've got this system that is still being used today and still being hated today and is totally misunderstood. But there's a lot of really great things that come out of looking at some of these things if we give them a chance.
Yeah, what people believe and why, rather than just dismissing the why, being curious about it and willing to, if not actually embrace these notions, to look at what's underneath all of that. I definitely hear that, and I appreciate everybody being willing to, I guess, jump on board with us during this conversation. But for now, let's take a brief moment to jump onto the phones. And before we do that, I think the crew actually has some great information we wanted to share with you.
Hi, I'm Mandisa Thomas, inviting you to the 2021 Women of Color Beyond Belief Conference. This monumental event, which features all women of color speakers, activists, and authors, will take place from September 24th through the 26th in Chicago, Illinois. Speakers include yours truly, Sakibu Hutchinson, and the nonprofit's own Cynthia McDonald. In-person registration and online streaming options are available. Please visit WOCBeyondBelief.com for ticket information, student discounts, and sponsorship opportunities. Women of Color Beyond Belief is proudly presented by Black Nonbelievers, the Black Skeptics Group, and the Women's Leadership Project.
Beautiful.
All right, definitely some great information worth checking out. I should say we've had Mandisa on the show before, as well as Cynthia, so doing really great work there, and I hope people will take a look. But in the meantime, for now, let's talk to Rachel in California, who is, I guess, wondering how to respond to some homophobia around her. Rachel, what's your story tonight?
Hi. So earlier this week at my work, I was a part of a conversation. My two coworkers were talking about how one of them was sending her daughter back into school. And my supervisor chimed in and started saying, oh, well, I'm not sure if you want to send your daughter back to school anymore in this environment. And her daughter is probably in first or second grade. And he goes on to say things like, they're teaching kids in school that there's 15 different genders now, or they're having drag queens come in and read to children. And they were kind of making like remarks about how that was a negative thing. And it really didn't sit well with me. But I also didn't know how to respond because they're conservative people, and I don't want to say, you're an asshole and shut them down like completely from opening up their minds. But I don't know. I know it'll come up again because my coworkers, usually when they discuss things, they bring them up quite a few times. But I'm just wondering like how I should better be a good ally in this situation.
Man, I wish that drag queens were getting invited to read to kids in schools. And, I don't know about 15 genders exactly, but yeah, that feels better than our current system. So what a beautiful fantasy that this person has created. But I guess I don't know that there is a right thing or a wrong thing to say. I'm very curious about Melissa's response, but I guess I'll just say before I hand it over that I don't know that you're obligated to any particular response. And that's maybe the biggest thing that I would highlight here. That if you feel like there is a opportunity for you to speak up and to be heard, to perhaps create a little bit of change, or at the very least create some like safer boundaries for yourself so that you don't have to deal with listening to that kind of bullshit, then great. Let's maybe game plan how to do that. But I feel like so often in these situations, we believe socially that there is something of a obligation to mix it up and to get in there and to fight the good fight. And perhaps there is some moral imperative in some circumstances, but I don't want you to walk away from this conversation feeling like there is some blanket rule that in order to be an ethical person, that you have to be willing to argue with your boss when he's kind of being an asshole. Melissa, what would you add or maybe disagree with in any of that?
Yeah, it is a cost benefit risk analysis.
Mm,
You definitely want to think about the pros and cons about saying something. I love the idea of setting boundaries where you can. Um, One thing that, I mean, I have a few questions, but one thing that comes to mind is if your company's large enough to have an HR department or a union, talking to them to advocate for diversity training, or working with them to set up diversity training can help. Um, do you have an HR company there or HR department?
We're actually a pretty small company. I think there's about 25 people. There is one person in HR, but
Okay. Do you feel like you might be able to talk to that person in HR and let them know your concerns and hope for advocating for a more inclusive environment with less discrimination? And
yeah, actually, I think that's a good idea. I think that she might be receptive to that kind of thing.
yeah.
Because it's not even the first time they've made these very bigoted comments about specific groups, so that might be helpful.
Yeah. I don't know a lot about your situation, so I don't want to put you into danger. There are ways to assert your own beliefs and values in a way that's respectful. And the way I usually suggest that is to own your own feelings. Don't just call someone an asshole. um, let them know, hey, I feel really hurt when you suggest that uh, um, gender diversity is not okay for little kids. And I'd rather you not talk about that here, or rather you keep those to yourself, right? And if you continue to talk about it, I will not be able to hang out with you at the water cooler. But you wouldn't really want to do these kind of things unless you felt safe. Your job safety, your safety with your coworkers, those kind of things are important. So risk benefit analysis. Does that help?
Yeah, that definitely helps.
yeah, I love that nonviolent communication sort of framework. That simple model of when you do this, I feel that. If you continue to do this, I will respond by, and just sort of expressing it in those plain terms. I think that's a really, really great framework. And Rachel, I hope that gives you something to work off of. But I guess I just want to say, you may not be able to like change minds or hearts or get through to somebody with these ideas. But I hope at the very least that you can work to create for yourself a safe environment where you don't feel like you're having to overhear a bunch of garbage. And so we definitely wish you the best here.
Oh, one other thing. HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, does have, or they did some years back, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but they do have some protocols on how to help businesses be more inclusive. So you might look up I don't remember the name of it, but you might check with HRC to see if they have anything that might help you to advocate for inclusion at your work.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you guys very much for the advice. I felt really poorly about myself after just not doing anything, but you guys have made a lot of good points, and I'll definitely try that nonviolent communication technique with them should it come up again.
Oh, well, now I want to tell you that you tell your coworker, for every time you say something that's discriminatory, I'm going to donate to this organization. But you don't do that either. But
I'm going to lose my paycheck at that rate.
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, thanks for calling.
Thank you. Yep, thank you very much. Love the show, guys. Bye.
Hey, thanks so much. You have a great night. All right. Well, let's talk briefly to B in Virginia, who has an update from a past call or from a past email. B, what's on your mind tonight?
Okay, so I had called in because I emailed in because someone in my role-playing group, seemingly, I got the message, had a problem with the villain of the story being what I consider gender fluid, queer, whatever you would call it.
Sure.
Turns out they have both valid and absolutely pisses me off complaints. One of the plot points that we had involved a rape, and he took issue with that.
Sure.
And I realized that was a mistake on my part to try to bring rape into the game when it used to be sort of fade to black if people have sex. But also, he just has a problem with there being queer representation, for lack of a better term, in the game at all. And
so it's not so much the issue that it be queer representation in the role of the villain, but just the fact that queer people would exist in this universe and in this game world. Was that kind of the complaint?
Right. Like, just on a spur of the moment, I decided, it doesn't really matter to the narrative. I will make this male character gay. I will imply that he has a boyfriend. And he took issue with that because he had plans of his female character trying to have a relationship with my character. And I was like, well, I guess that's not going to happen.
Well, I'm glad that you were able to navigate that, I suppose. It definitely sounds like a wild world. Any last insights that you can offer to the audience? I do appreciate you kind of updating us on how that story played out.
Yeah, check with your other players if you're going to include a rape. That didn't go over well.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that that's fair to say. There are very real conversations to be had about the way that we depict sexual violence in media. I am never going to stand on the side of saying that we shouldn't be able to explore these sincerely scary things through our art and through our culture, or that we should be stifling those voices. I also know that I don't love using that as a shortcut or a cheap shock factor, or being sort of careless in how triggering or how significant that experience is for many, many people in our culture. So thank you so much for giving us a call and just kind of updating us on your story. And I think that that's a really meaningful takeaway for all of us.
Thank you.
You have a great night. All right. Well, before we jump back into the conversation, let's take a moment to see what's been going on around the rest of the ACA. As if the idea of like talking meat just slapping against each other is not like inherently weird and gross and silly and fun and beautiful and sexy.
Hey, you may get in a plane crash in the Himalayas, and you might have to eat your friend. But like, you wouldn't want to eat your friend every day. Like, that doesn't mean that's reasonable for you to go around eating your friends all the time.
So we originally had a 4-up today, but unfortunately I murdered our 4th host in cold blood right before the show. So it's only the 3 of us today.
Go ahead.
Yes. So I will say that if this is supposed to be God's love, then y'all can keep it.
I would believe that he existed, and I would be, instead of doing the atheist experience, I would be doing the God is a piece of experience. It's explaining how I believe that this God exists and how neither me nor anyone else should worship him, despite the consequences.
Whew, well said. Heavy stuff. All right. Well, let's get back to this kind of tricky conversation, because I know that we are obviously trying to condense a lot of information here when we talk about the history of these practices. But what can you teach us about where some of these ideas come from?
Okay. Well, for a very long time, sex and mystical experiences was pretty normal. And the idea of sex and magic is fairly new. And you can see the progression over time of how each thing influenced each thing. Um, and there's this very common theme overall that, it starts off with like the creation myths from the old times, right?
Mhm.
Uh, I don't know. I'm having a hard time putting my words together right now. Um, it's just it's been a ongoing story and history to the part of our human existence.
Yeah, fair to say. I mean, I think that it's almost impossible to even get into the mindset of some of the prehistorical belief systems and different things that contributed to this. I mean, we're obviously talking about practices that in many ways are as old as humanity itself. But for our more modern times, whether we're talking about tantra or sex magic or some of these other things, what should we understand about the philosophy or maybe the goal of these practices? What are some of the I guess universal objectives that people are seeking, or the needs that are seeking to be met here?
Ah, well, it's kind of interesting because I'm not exactly. There is this. Well, let me think about this. Um, in there's tantra that's Buddhist and also Hindi, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they have very different approaches. And like I said, I haven't studied either of them, but there is, in general, I think of yoga, and yoga is this union of our higher selves to our lower selves. It's this idea that there is uh, something divine that we can associate with. Like, for instance, with the Kiss of the Yogini book, what I found so interesting is that way back when, the higher caste Brahmins would have sex with these yoginis that would, uh, uh, raise their level of connection from just being, men to being divine men, right?
Mm.
And eventually, that didn't work out. Only a small number of people were able to access these rights, and they wanted to make them for everyone. So they got internalized into chakras. Now, if you look at chakras and their history, there's like, I don't know how many different systems, at least seven that I know of. And chakras just represent this idea that, yes, we're human, but we can reach some kind of um, understanding of something divine. Now, what that divine is, it's in that, like I want to refer to the Zohar, um, which is a text from the 13th century. Um, it symbolizes the sexual unity of the husband and wife as divine and treated with deep respect. And this divine union elevates the mind of the husband to the divine realm, drawing down the divine light and the Shekinah herself, descending into the semen. Now, this is the 13th century, but it's not much different from you know, 5th century Tantra, if I have that right, and I
Hmm.
forget my dates. Um, uh,
Should we take much from the, seemingly like universality of some of these explorations?
oh, I love that question. Yeah, why not? You know, um, it's kind of neat to um, think about sex from a different perspective, that somehow it can liberate us. That if we stop to think about all of the things that limit us and our ability to experience our own pleasure, to own our own pleasure, and to share pleasure with others, yeah, look into some of these practices. They can help liberate us from the limiting beliefs that we hold.
Hmm. Well, I know that we have touched on Tantra in particular. Are there some other like significant ideas that have come up through the ages? What are some of the broad overviews of like the general schools of thought on these subjects?
Okay. So before I go there, let me say more about this liberation.
Sure.
Really, the Zohar really fed into my understanding is that it kind of fed into the idea of um, the Catholic Mass. And, you know, it is a liberating idea to take something and to transform it, right? Um, and you see this all throughout history. Alchemy, for example, used to be these old guys, trying to, create gold, right? Let's take all these metals and turn them into gold. But eventually, alchemy came to represent a more spiritual, internal aspect. We turn ourselves into a better person through these practices. Everything that I have studied and read is really all about um, liberation and transformation. Now, what happens to each of these things that I've studied is that they're all encased in their own school of thought of
Hmm.
how that happens. So you either buy into that school of thought or you don't, but I think at least knowing the school of thought helps you better to understand what you're buying into.
Yeah, and I like to imagine some of these things as a framework, just as a lens for trying to understand how other people have experienced their sexuality. As a therapist, like I am often in the role of asking people about these like really deep and sophisticated and oftentimes like ineffable parts of themselves as they're trying to discuss or describe a feeling. And they're often like stumbling around awkwardly trying to put these emotions into words. And then I'm trying to take what they're giving me and, in some form or fashion, unravel it or just get a sense of what they're after. Communication is incredibly challenging. I think it is the most fascinating, most beautiful aspect of our species. The fact that we have all of these different complex languages, the fact that we have this body language, that our intonation, that all of the ideas that we are able to communicate simply by pushing air through our diaphragm or from our diaphragm and through our lungs, vibrating our vocal cords, all into a syntax and a communication system to somehow take the ideas that are in our heads and to put them into somebody else's heads. It's a kind of magic all unto itself. And so oftentimes when we look at some of these practices, what's interesting to me is to see how other people describe their sexuality or describe their love or their romance or their connection to others, simply as a way of trying to get myself into somebody else's eyes or inside of somebody else's skull. Are there, other strategies for other ways that these tools can be useful?
Hmm. Well, let me think about this. I'm not sure which tools you mean, spiritual tools and magical tools and religious tools.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I am trying to get across is just that it is incredibly difficult to talk about love, incredibly difficult to talk about sexuality. sex is such a complex idea. Love is a incredibly complex idea. I mean, the different versions of it that my clients sort of parade in front of me week in and week out is just baffling. And so I see a lot of these practices as a detailed description of one particular person's or one particular culture's way of understanding those things. And so even if I don't necessarily resonate with those ideas, or even if some of those ideas don't pass muster in certain like scientific ways, somebody said them for a reason and somebody described themselves that way for a reason. And I just see it as a form of like symbolic language for better understanding somebody. And by exploring Tantra and some of these other practices, I think we develop like a lexicon that we can share with our partners in order to better communicate. And I guess I'm wondering if that's a valid use of these tools.
Mm. I love your focus on communication. What comes up for me is the fact that tied to communication is the way we think and feel and experience the world. So, yeah, I guess it's important to communicate. But often what I do is I focus on the individual person. And the thought that comes to mind is I went to Peru. And in Peru, you have these old Inca temples where the Spanish built the churches right on top. They leveled them until about a foot, and then they built their church on top of it. And if you go inside these churches, temples, you'll see that the Last Supper is painted. And instead of the turkey that I'm used to seeing at the Last Supper, there is gooey, which is, flattened. What is gooey? I've already forgotten in Spanish, but it's just flattened meat, and it's just flattened on a platter. These we can't ever assume what anybody's religion or spiritual practices are. We can't ever know really the in-depth knowledge that goes behind some of these beliefs and ideas. So yes, it can give us a language to communicate with, but I think really we should always be in search of meaning.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're obviously talking about some, very ancient practices and some very deeply rooted historical things. When does the modern world of sexual spirituality begin to take shape? Whether we're talking about the perhaps more huckster leaning, like less believable forms of it, or things that are more rooted in tradition, or things that may even be more rooted in practical science. When do we see what we would like kind of currently understand as sacred sexuality, or some of these other things begin to take shape?
That's a tough one. It used to be that we would tell kids if they masturbated, their palms would get hairy, right?
Yeah, I was definitely told that I would go blind.
Oh, there you go. Gosh, and you're young.
Yeah.
So, and that's a focus on people with penises, not necessarily people with vaginas, because
Yeah, because girls don't masturbate, right? Yeah, naturally.
no, we have no sexuality, of course. So, really, even today, our sexual understanding is very limited because research is very limited because it's not highly funded. So, there's a lot of questions that can be asked here about sexuality, both from its evolution and spiritual practices, or its meaning for humans. But what I really think is happening now and has been is that we just have introduced more of these ideas because, Tantra wasn't brought to Americas until like the 19th century. And that came out slowly. And we can trace who introduced these things and how they got out to the public, if you do the research. And once more people start getting exposed to this, it either gets a lot of pushback or a lot of interest. Now, some people in the early 19th century ran with it. They're like, oh, look at this cool stuff. sacred sexuality, sex magic, oh la la, a very Victorian time frame, like, anything but these corsets and these terrible modern rules that we had at the time. But as time has grown, we're finding a little bit more space to um, be more sexual, to explore our sexual selves a little bit more. We still don't even have language for what two women do together in sexual intimacy,
Yeah.
or what people who are gender diverse are doing in sexual diversity. And we need to expand that knowledge base, that word base, that understanding. And to do that, we have to be always curious about what these things mean to the individual, rather than just looking at the whole thing, calling it crap, and moving on.
Yeah. So, is there value then in adapting some of these older, more traditional viewpoints or paradigms? Is there vocabulary that we can maybe grab, or even just metaphor or modeling, symbolic language, or anything else that we might be able to kind of pull from the past and bring up with us into the current to, I guess, to feed our like impoverished word base here?
Yeah, I cringe a little bit because I'm thinking of in my lifetime and in my search for meaning and understanding, some really craptacular, unethical people that I've run into.
Sure.
And, I'm not encouraging everyone to go out and join the Hare Krishnas and do whatever else. And I really want people to uh, really use their brain cells to figure out how to safely and sanely and consensually, enjoy their experience on this earth. Um, so, yes, my short answer is yes. I take practices from alchemy, I take practices from ceremonial magic, I take practices from just an innumerable number of places. Um, and what I mostly use all of those for is mindfulness,
Hmm.
so that I can be more present in my sexuality. Um, and that includes meditation, grounding exercises, creative visualization. I'm trained in neurolinguistic programming and hypnosis. Um, all of these things are tools to help us connect deeper to ourselves. Study modern analysis to really work with unconscious motivations from early childhood. Like, I am really all about learning the most about myself. And that means being open to, I mean, not ridiculously open to, but open to things that really speak to me. So, it may not speak to others, though.
Yeah, is there a not a litmus test necessarily, but is there any strategies that you might recommend for how to incorporate these things without finding yourself like too far down the well?
I don't know how to avoid going too far down the well. That seems to be my specialty. Um,
Fair to say.
yeah, I remember one time I was running a group, and a group member gave me a button that says, I'm just someone who likes to learn. And it's true. I just love to learn. But, um, from some of the negative experiences I have had with people who are doing things out there that I don't find wholly ethical, um, my idea is to tell people is to research ideas and books in the library, talk to friends, get ideas, talk to a therapist who specializes in this sexuality, like get some ideas before you just go out and join the next cult or sign up for the next orgasm class anywhere. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, ultimately, how should we understand some of these practices? I mean, are they religions? Are they rudimentary forms of science? Are they metaphors or symbols, or what else could we use to describe some of the things we're talking about here?
Mm, yeah. I was just watching a video on Tantra, where this person was talking about ways to understand Tantra. And before you can get there, you have to practice some ideas on uh, non-harm, compassion. I don't know all the things that go into it, but um, I think every time the video goes straight on me, I get anxious. And then, Christy, can you tell me again what your question was?
Yeah, I guess I am just trying to find what category, what box we might be able to
Oh,
put some of these things in.
yeah, but how is that box helpful though? Like, what does that? What does that
Yeah,
aid?
and that's fair to say. Like, I don't know that we are talking about religions. I don't know that it's entirely fair to say that we're talking about science, even rudimentary science. But I do know that these practices have some value, and it's difficult to categorize. And a lot of what we're discussing, I feel like, has already gotten pretty esoteric and pretty uh, difficult to conceptualize. And so, any container that you might be able to give us, so that we can walk away from this conversation with a sense of maybe how to understand these things and how to navigate this like kind of pseudo scientific world.
Yeah, I can tell you the container. The container is you. Um, my practices and beliefs go through the filter of my psychology training.
Mm.
So, you know, what most of these practices do for me is help me regulate my nervous system, help me be more present in my body rather than anxiously running off in my mind. Um, they help me shift my perspective on how I see myself. For the longest time, I identified as agnostic, and I felt kind of separated from the rest of the world who had giant communities, right? Giant communities. And here I am, agnostic, and I don't have any community. And not only that, I felt like crap because now I'm just nobody with nothing.
Mm.
But the thing about me for being Gnostic is that I was able to reclaim something that's ultimately larger than myself, whether it be something I aspire to, whether it be something I just really want to embody for myself. And that allowed me to love myself more. Now, not everybody needs that. Not everybody needs to look at all these practices that they might come across as being psychologically motivated. Um, some people want to believe in angels. Some people want to believe in the spirits and do Native American rituals that bring them into the dark caves, into the underground to visit the ancestors. I really, we can't study those empirically, but we do have our own containers and find our own meaning. And I think that's important to recognize and honor that we each do our own thing to try to get through this world.
Yeah, I really like that lens for understanding all of this. Are there any particular practices that you might want to mention? You don't necessarily have to demonstrate them for us, but I guess I'll go ahead and mention that like tantric massage and yab yum are two things that my partner and I have found to be incredibly opening and powerful just in our desire to connect with one another. Is there anything that you might mention to the audience who might be curious or interested to explore some of these things?
Yeah. Um, Meditation, which is really paying attention to intentional focus.
Mm.
Um, Eye gazing, shared breathing,
Mm-hmm.
um, focusing on meditations that are guided, that have the idea of pleasure. Um, most of the work that I've done to understand practices and beliefs that I practice um, have meant that I have to pay attention to how I think about myself, think about the world, how I consider my sexual health, how I feel deserving of love. There are so many things that go into uh, being able to be having sex with the lights on and the bodies that we inhabit, with the stress that we're under, anything that helps us to just be in the moment rather than worried about our performance or worried about our bills, those are the things that I would really just take as much as you can from any system anywhere.
Sure, and we'll make sure to have a handful of those practices or some descriptions in the show notes for this episode. But where else can folks go to learn more about some of these practices? Are there any websites or resources or other information that you might want to point people towards?
Nope. I really want this to be everyone's journey. And, there are organizations, I talk to couples all the time about expanding their erotic canvas by maybe looking into um, uh, kink that will help them feel more connected. And the thing is that um, I can't, I can lead them places to go, but ultimately I think it's a very personal discussion and
Hmm.
conversation and figuring out where people's interests are and then helping them figure out what might be good resources for that, how to figure out primary sources and secondary sources. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, I don't have all the places. But I think if people are curious and they're interested, then yeah, reach out to me, reach out to you. We'll help them figure it out, right? Because we don't
Yeah,
want to steer them in the wrong direction.
fair to say. Well, I know that no matter how many times we say that we are, not embracing the supernatural or talking about anything that can't be understood or experienced on a personal level, that there are plenty of folks watching who are probably laughing and still feeling incredibly skeptical. And I guess I'm just curious if there's anything in particular that you would want to say to those folks.
Mm, yeah. It's okay to laugh, and you have every right to set up barriers to anything your mind just doesn't want to deal with. I totally get it. If you're a little curious, I would ask you to pay attention to that curiosity and nurture it. That's all.
Yeah. No, well said. Any other final thoughts that you'd like to leave with the audience tonight before we wrap up?
Ah, everyone deserves pleasure. I do not say this enough. Everyone deserves pleasure, and there are many ways to come to it. And it doesn't have to just be, you know, um, missionary on the bed. There's a lot of ways to get outside of that. And some of these practices, um, bless them all, are things that help us get outside of our little box on how we think things should always be. They can be more.
Incredibly well said. Well, thank you so very much. I'd love to tell people where they can learn more about your work. We'll get some links up on the screen, but where should people be looking for you around the web?
Oh, www.hillcountrytherapy.com. That's me. And I'm Melissa Hargrave. I am a psychotherapist um, and adventurer in this wide world that we have. You can find me in the Austin area. I do teletherapy and in person.
All right. Well, perfect. I, of course, want to take a moment to remind people about different ways that they can access all of the shows of the ACA. If you go to tiny.cc/AEN podcast, you'll find a collection of audio only for everything that you saw in the video a few moments ago, as well as everything that's current and going on within the organization. I'd also encourage people who want to keep this conversation going and who maybe have some curiosity, maybe have some disagreements, maybe have some skepticism or whatever else to join into the conversation. You can find me pretty well every day in the fan group on Facebook. The Secular Sexuality fan group is a great place to continue these debates and to better understand one another as we talk about some of these things. For today, you can continue the conversation right after this show if you're catching us live at tiny.cc/ACD Discord. The atheist community of Discord is a great community for getting in touch with this atheist community of Austin. If you'd like to support the show, I would invite you to check out tiny.cc/merchaca. We've got a number of great products. You can see my shirt on the wall just behind us, a number of stickers and other great things. All of those profits help to keep the lights on here and help to keep the show going. So we very much appreciate you taking a look. Outside of that, it's time for, I guess, the most important part of the evening, which is our crew cam, in which you get to see and I get to thank all of the incredible people that help make this show happen, that help us do the work that we're doing here. Thank you all so much for helping us to put all of this together and for making Melissa and I look and sound so good. And otherwise, Melissa, I just want to say thank you so much for helping us to kind of wrap our head around some of these like really challenging topics. And I want to encourage everybody listening to maybe be a little bit open-minded, to be a little bit curious, to get in touch with their senses and with their sense of pleasure, and to go ahead and give themselves a big old orgasm. Or better yet, to give somebody else one.
Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.